Welcome to Backpacking America, an analytical podcast. So, David Rovics, welcome to
Thank you.
Backpacking America. You are very welcome. You are a folk singer, activist, and you've been doing this for how long?
Well, gosh, I guess I lose track of time, but for a long time now. Long time. This is the '90s, really, full time. Anyway.
So, what inspired you to write and perform labor folk music?
Well, I mean, as with these things, so often it basically runs in the family more or less. I mean, my parents are both musicians, not so much in the folk vein, more classical musicians, but I grew up around near sort of in the other side of the Hudson from Beacon, from in Connecticut, but in that region of, you know, New England, New York. So in the '70s when I was a kid, so I was exposed to a lot of this kind of music early on. In retrospect, like Pete Seeger, yeah, and then
I love Pete
yeah,
Seeger.
me too, yeah. And it was later that I got into writing and playing music myself, but the exposure was very early in life, so hard to say
So,
where
if
it
you could
started.
pick a so if you could pick like a defining moment where you said this is just what I'm going to do, what would it be?
Oh, that's interesting. A defining moment where I mean, I guess it was really when I really decided I was going to just make a go of trying to do music for a living or in some form of professionally. I guess it was a bit of a defining moment when I dropped out of college for the second time. In When I had gone back to college in '93 to go to Evergreen State College with some vague ideas of wanting to be a sort of academic left-wing intellectual type, and then it was just too much studying and too little time for music, and I was just going nuts, and also I was older than most of the students, and that was also a bit awkward for me. It was kind of weird being 10 years older than most of the students, because it's a very traditional campus in terms of 18 to 22, and nobody's older than 22, and it was just also just being a little older it would have been easier to be like a fully adult student, like coming in at my age or something, but being 26 and hanging around, it was just I couldn't do it. And then that was a pretty defining moment, was sort of realizing that I couldn't hack the university setting of life, and so that's when I kind of stopped thinking about doing anything else, really.
So when you left the university and you decided to be a musician, I'm sure you were debating about what genre to get into, and one of the two major genres, at least for me, during my time in college, is folk music and punk. And my question for you would be: do you think folk and punk serve the same purpose and racial demographic, with the only difference being folk targeting white rural America and punk targeting urban white America?
And that's an interesting point, and it's perhaps true to some extent in terms of the both the racial and the sort of rural urban divide there. But I mean, for me, it was not a question of deciding on a genre really, and it was more a question of just of being of what I was exposed to, and then. Yeah, and so as really, I was exposed to a lot of stuff, but in terms of what I was exposed to, that was explicitly political and spoke to me in terms of like talking about what was happening in the world. I mean, it was like singer songwriters that would be put into the more or less folk category, although it's a very troublesome word and I tend to avoid it, but the folk, because it's just so differently defined by different people, kind of like the word socialist or anarchist or something. It's just got way too many definitions. And so, but I actually didn't really get thoroughly exposed to punk rock until I started touring with Attila the Stockbroker in England, a punk rock musician in England who's well known in certain circles there. Poet and punk rock musician, has a band called Barnstormer, and he driving around England with Attila, he basically exposed me to loads of punk rock in the form of his cassette collection. But that was so. I guess I would say, undoubtedly, at least when I listen to my music, there's no question that when you listen to the stuff that I started doing by that time period around 2004, I think the punk rock influence starts to become fairly evident. But I think my music before that was very, I think clearly, my influence was bluegrass and singer songwriters, and maybe you could hear that influence. And I mean, also a lot of African, but I don't know how, when you see a white guy playing the guitar, you don't think afro-pop. So I mean, if you're thinking about it, I think you can hear actually the similarities between afro-pop and bluegrass. There's a lot of similarities. I don't know why exactly. Like, I mean, in terms of the origins of the music, but in terms of the sort of Afro-pop electric guitar playing and bluegrass mandolin playing have a lot in common. But but definitely, I listen to a lot of both, and and I'm sure most people, if they hear my guitar playing, they think bluegrass. But I think that's also just because I'm a white guy with a guitar, and they don't think about the possibility that Ali Farka Touré had, an influence along with uh, any number of just traditional bluegrass musicians.
Yeah, I never would have thought that you were inspired by Afropop. So when you do play and you incorporate this into your work, um, you specifically define yourself as a bluegrass artist just because it makes more sense, but really you're into Afropop, and that's the how you want to bring it into the labor movement with your songs
I
is
mean,
Afropop.
I think the whole question of genres and is really something that it's a bit contentious, and it always has been, because it's like it's totally understandable and necessary because we're using language, right? We're speaking about music using words, and so naturally we need to use words to represent what we're talking about, and that means putting things into boxes, because that's what words do, but there's an insidious aspect to the whole question of genres, which just goes back to, like, the I guess the beginning of what we whatever wherever we call the beginning of the corporate music industry. What in some ways it goes back way into the 19th century, way before recorded music, when talking about sheet music and stuff. But certainly since the record industry became a huge thing, genre has always been used as a racial divide mechanism, as a basically a sort of a race veiled form, not so veiled form of racism, and that musicians have had to go along with for over a century in order to ever get a recording contract, generally, with some exceptions. I mean, in the 60s in San Francisco, there was a lot of pushback, and in other situations since then, there's been a lot of pushback, and the collapse of the music industry has been helpful for being able to bust out of all these boxes, because what's the use of putting yourself in a box if there's no big advantage to it with, like, a record contract, because there's no record contracts, so there's been a lot more experimentation since music is much less of a profitable thing for most people than it used to be. But the genre thing is troubling, because I mean it's always been a way to keep black musicians in black bands and white musicians in white bands, and not to allow them to intermingle, because then it's not a genre that you can easily market as, for the white radio stations or the black radio stations, which is the history of this country. Sadly, it's just how it is. It's no escaping the history.
I was about to ask if it's a good thing you brought that up, because I was going to ask if it was a form of colonialism, really, if for music genres, because a lot of I know that jazz and rock and roll all started with black musicians, and then that history was eliminated and commercialized, and what was the word, appropriated.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
it's very sad.
Yeah, I mean the history, of course, it's out there, but the what has so consistently happened with is black music. I mean, what's just unbelievable but true is rock and roll, as defined by the music industry, for the most part, is certainly prior to the '60s San Francisco, scene. Rock and roll was a white form of music, which is totally bizarre because because it is a black form of music in origin, right? But if you were black and you played rock and roll, then you were rhythm and blues, right? So and then if you wanted to be really really famous and have a massive following, then you needed to be playing rock and roll, and you needed to be white, and be Elvis, I mean, but the way, I mean, and I think many of the white musicians from many different genres, very much including rock and roll, who became very rich and famous, were very conflicted about it, and really felt like it was a terribly unfair situation that they were taking advantage of. And I mean, they were conscious of the reality of the situation, that they were famous and getting all this promotion because they were white people playing black music and doing it really well, for sure. Like Elvis was very talented, and the Animals were very talented, but they were, that's what they were taking advantage of, because the music industry wasn't going to be marketing a black band the way they would market a white band, and they wouldn't market them to the white audience. I mean, in fact, shockingly, for a modern audience who is now used to at least some degree of mixing of demographics in pop music. I mean, as Mike Africa Jr. recently reminded me, it wasn't until Michael Jackson, with Thriller, that you had the phenomenon of black musicians crossing into what had been almost pretty much completely white pop music arena. He was the first black musician to have a hit in this in the white pop music arena. Like this was Mike Africa's parents were in prison for 40 years, and in eastern Pennsylvania, listening to these white rock and roll stations and stuff, because that's all that was out there: white rock and roll stations and bluegrass. They had never heard hip hop until they finally were let out of prison, and they thought, what is this stuff? It's very violent. Was their first impression when they heard hip hop? Oh, these people are very angry. I mean, they had been for 40 years in a prison in a rural eastern Pennsylvania. So, but the first time they heard black musician on these stations, they had no choice but to listen to was like 1980 something with Michael Jackson.
That's amazing. Yeah, it's I feel that definitely today, like, the demographics have changed, and now it's I think in rap there's more freedom, especially, and it's more accessible because you could be your own person, especially with hip hop, R&B. You could be a solo artist and not really, you don't even really need to play an instrument. You just need to have a voice, an idea, and mixing. And a lot of people I know are, they experiment with rap, or they're SoundCloud artists or whatever, and they make something for themselves. They may not be famous, but they're expressing themselves, and they have a very decent following. And I feel that that's just a really great way, almost like podcasts, to like reclaim expression from corporate control.
Yeah, yeah, and is definitely like with podcasts, or with playing music with a guitar and voice, or doing hip hop and coming up with tracks to rap over. It's all very minimalist and easy to do when you don't have a whole lot of resources. But so it makes sense that in the modern period, when the music industry is less than 20% of what it once was in terms of the economy of the music industry, makes sense that people are now recording in their bedrooms and stuff like that. Is all they can afford to do.
And a good segue for the modern times, I've listened to some of your new album, Notes from a Failed State,
Mm-hmm.
and I liked how it touched on the modern issues of imperialism and unrest at home. There's many that say that they have the answers to these issues. How do you think the left should fight back against the fascists in this country?
Yeah, it's a really good and important and huge question. And then I think, then there's the question of who is the left and how is that defined? And I mean, because would have been nice when in terms of the left fighting back against fascism, it would have been nice if, for example, the Democratic Party had managed to uh, come up with a candidate that had some appeal to the left, and who might even be considered a left candidate, like Bernie Sanders or even Elizabeth Warren. But instead, we come up with the guy who's responsible for the crime bill of 1994 and the invasion of Iraq, and this guy is an imperialist neoliberal free trade joke, and he's from the state that is dominated by banks and insurance companies, and we're supposed to believe that this guy has the working class at heart, or has any capacity to bring this country out of the shambles that it's in. It's such a sad state of affairs. So for one thing, unfortunately, the liberals have not delivered any kind of left, any kind of, a response to Trump. So we can count that out. So then forget about electoral politics. It's not happening, and there is no effective response coming from electoral politics. So then, what should the left do? And what's left of the left, the extra parliamentary left? What should we do? I would say, ideally, ultimately, I don't know if it's going to necessarily come down to so much a matter of response directly to fascists, and I hope it isn't all about sort of a response, or ideological sort of warfare between anti-fascists and fascists, because there's just so much brainwashing going on with Fox News, and it's not these other, and the president, and it's not a battle that can, I think, easily be won in terms of just shouting about whether somebody's a fascist or not. But when it comes down to the kinds of things that are going to be happening very soon in this society, like the uh, meltdown of, I mean, we're looking at, with the extension of all these eviction moratoriums, that all that they are doing around the country, like the CDC's recent eviction moratorium that goes until the end of the year. All they're doing is kicking the can down the road, but the can they're kicking down the road is the ultimate possibility of 40 million people getting evicted from their homes all at the same time, and across the country. Which, I mean, we're talking about, like, people who live in the more kind of low grade apartments, like the one I'm in right now, what they call Class C apartments. The majority of people in Class C apartments throughout the country are suffering, are the majority of renters, period, in Portland right now are going without either food or medicine in order to pay the rent. One out of three renters in Portland are behind on their rent. So it's a cataclysmic situation here and around the country, and from an economic standpoint. And what I believe is possible, if the left is able to get together. I'm making my own efforts here, but I'm only in one place. But what I believe is possible and necessary is if the left can effectively take on this whole question of whose world is this, and whose housing is this, and who should be owning all this, and who should be profiting off of this, and should there be some kind of regulations in terms of controlling the cost of rent. And I think these kinds of ideas can potentially become more and more popular among anybody who's struggling, whatever their political orientation is or was. And if they see that there's a widespread movement going on that's looking out for the interests of anybody who's facing the possibility of being evicted from their apartment, regardless of what kind of ideological background or racial background or anything else they're coming out of, I think that's the way forward. I think if the left has always, if it has any potential appeal among the broad masses of people in any society, it's when the left is able to capably address questions of basic survival in a way that capitalism is failing to address it. I think that's the potential strength of the left, is the realization that the working class is the vast majority of society, and the billionaires are a tiny minority, and they are making life impossible for the rest of us. And that's an easy argument to make, because and we are the majority, so it is the vast majority. So it's the truth is on our side. But what happens, I think, too much is people getting into these debates about minutiae, and getting into debates about social issues that are not necessarily directly economic issues, which is, I think, very strategic on the part of all kinds of forces in society that don't want the left to effectively address the situation we're in. Let's all have arguments about how much we can overcome our internal biases towards each other for our race, gender, or sexual orientation, and let's talk about our microaggressions and internal biases, endlessly, and instead of talking about, how we're going to solve the imminent problem of 40 million people, mostly people of color, getting evicted from their homes. If you care about people of color, let's talk about how we're going to prevent them from being evicted from their homes. Really, nobody cares about your internal biases if you're not going to go around shouting at people on the streets. It's much more important that everybody has a place to live. And that argument holds water anywhere I make it. When real people are involved, and it's not somewhere in the nether regions of the internet. On some subreddit.
Interesting. I find that point interesting. I do agree that this is a serious issue, and it's odd that the left as a whole, especially a lot of outside of the IWW, I haven't seen really any, or really the DSA, any serious attempt at forming tenants unions, or a solidified network to prevent houselessness. I feel like this is more of a, hey, look, we're gonna get evicted, and just kind of staring into the sun, waiting for it to crash upon us.
Yeah, there's a
And
lot of
that's
that, because it's really easy to feel like there's no potential way forward. But I mean, you do have to point out how horrible the situation is before anybody's going to fight back. But I think people tend to feel really pessimistic until there's a real indication that victory is possible.
What's interesting though is what you said about the microaggressions and the internal biases. Wouldn't you say that, because what I've seen is that with the DSA and other left organizations that I've been in, I used to be in Socialist Party.
Mm.
A lot of these microaggressions ended up affecting the organizing work. So, would you agree that if these aggressions are affecting organizing work, should it be addressed? Would that affect organizing a tenants union? Would that make it harder to prevent evictions if these aggressions are in such quantity and in every leftist?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, it's not like it's not like we should ignore the kinds of microaggressions we're talking about in terms of like the functioning of organizations and in society generally. Microaggressions have huge impact on people overall, and they definitely need to be addressed. It's just that this is the main discourse that you'll hear about on corporate and so-called public media, and in much of the sort of independent, pseudo-independent discourse. You'll hear people talking about their personal growth and overcoming their personal biases, and what they can do to be better people. And they're self-absorbed, navel-gazing, middle-class white people who are talking like that, and nobody else cares. Nobody cares about your mental state, basically. I mean, yeah, your friends hopefully care, but you're not going to change society by whether you improve your smile as you're passing people of color on the sidewalk. I mean, you might make somebody feel good for a moment, but and that's great, but you're going to there's some priorities here. I mean, and when you're talking about institutional racism and structural racism and the caste system in this society, then there are basic economic changes that need to be made, basic political changes that need to be made, and other things actually will fall into place. Actually, you don't actually need to figure out all your internal bias stuff. You need to get rid of the caste system we live in, and lo and behold, once you're no longer living in a caste society, all the baggage, all your internal baggage will start working itself out in all kinds of ways, because that's just how it is when you live in a society where everybody's getting the same kind of access to housing and education, and look, they can all dress the same way because they all have access to the same kind of resources. I mean, if you're in a Scandinavian society, you don't know who's rich or who's poor walking down the street, because everybody has enough, and everybody can afford to dress at the same mall, and so it's not, you can't tell the difference, and so and then that affects people in terms of how they treat each other when they can't tell the difference between anybody in terms of their class background. you know so it will happen here too. It just has to first, we have to overcome those other gaping hole problems, like extreme wealth and extreme poverty side by side.
I'm so glad you mentioned that because the what I've really noticed is a lot of white people will, like you said, the middle class white people will only do this really for clout, and they won't do it for the right reason, which is to not be racist and to try to work and use their privilege to benefit the cause. So I'm so glad you said that because I know a lot of people that are like that, and I've seen a lot of stuff on the internet like that, like the black post on Instagram. And if you don't do that, you're a racist. And it's so funny for me to see that because I've been agitating for 8 years and seriously organizing throughout college. And I can tell you that, like, I didn't post a black square because I knew that if I did that, I would be shutting out resources that were being posted on Instagram for organizers and community members. And what that ended up doing was it created a whole log of a whole just black screen hiding all these resources posted on the internet. So it ended up crippling a lot of organizing for about a week.
Interesting. Yeah, I was only vaguely paying attention to the black square thing. I mean, as if it's something that's mainly going on online, I figure it's not too much worth paying attention to. But maybe that's just my elderly bias.
I was listening to your other song, As I Watch Minneapolis Burn. It was a very touching song, and it highlights the severity of the situation, and it reminds me of songs about Katrina and the crimes the government let occur there, and it's similar to the crimes that were let occur in Minneapolis by the police. So, why don't you tell me a little bit about that song? Like, when you first saw Minneapolis burning, uh, what were your initial feelings?
Um, well, uh, that this was, I mean, basically, I was feeling for quite a while since the pandemic hit, and before really, but especially since the pandemic hit, it was quite evident that we were sitting on a powder keg. And that the divisions within society were becoming so much more starkly exposed by the pandemic and the economic fallout of the pandemic. So, like, the way Latinx and Black people have been dying at 4 to 5 times the rate of white people, and the way so many people in so-called, essential jobs were the ones getting exposed, and how so many of them are people of color, and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there's so many things getting exposed, getting exacerbated by the pandemic, and then on top of that, Trump, trying to, stir things up even more with all his racist rhetoric. So it was just for so many reasons. I mean, after decades of budget cutting and austerity since the demise of social democracy, or whatever semblance of it we ever had in the U.S. Starting in the 70s, things have just been getting worse in this country in terms of the divide between the rich and poor, and the stagnation or collapse of industries or real wages, and the collapse of the union movement. There's things that just keep on getting worse, and then you got the pandemic and Trump and all these new gifts to the rich and new budget cutting of social spending. I mean, it gets to the point where obviously it's to any idiot could tell we're sitting on a powder cake. So it's not complicated at that point. So then what was it going to be that was going to set it off? Well, that's the thing that left-wing intellectuals are always trying to predict and never right. They're never right. They never predict it in terms of when it's going to kick off, what's going to make it kick off. I mean, any of us could have predicted that things would kick off because of ICE separating parents from children, and just the incredible, horrible, unspeakable way that they are treating human beings at the border. I mean, that, if anything, could make millions of people react, with complete outrage and moral indignation. It could have been that. It could have been any number of extreme outrages being committed by our government. Unfortunately, there's so many. But what did it was, 8 minutes and 46 seconds of a cop torturing somebody on the middle of the street, in broad daylight, caught on video in Minneapolis. And then, the fact that that was only the nth time that had been, similar things had been caught on tape. And that was not surprising that was going to be the spark that would set off the powder keg. And when I saw Minneapolis burning, my feeling was that finally there's a large cross section of society that is totally fed up, which is when cities catch fire, it's often an indication that this has moved beyond a handful or a relative handful of politically conscious people who probably won't be going to burn down police stations because they know what the potential consequences are, and they're too afraid of the consequences. When things like this happen, and people are willing to go burn down police stations regardless of the potential consequences because they're just so angry, that's a real sign that something has really caught fire within the hearts of a large cross section of people, and that was clearly the case. And also it's in the song I'm talking about Minneapolis burning because it's a nice image, rather than talking about all the cities of the country burning. But actually that's what was going on. It was every major city in the country was having demonstrations, many of which, if not most of which, also took the form of attempted burning down of police stations or other similar activities directed at police properties or other entities like the police, ICE, FBI, and of course corporate chains and banks and that represent gentrification and represent the impoverishment of the working class, which is very well understood by people around the country. They know what these banks represent. They know who's loaning them money at usurious interest rates so they can try to buy a house or have a credit card. They know what these banks are. They're not stupid. They're not burning down the local corner store. The 7-Eleven is not a local corner store. The 7-Eleven is a major corporation. Wells Fargo is a major corporation. You can call it a franchise all you want, but people don't see franchises when they see Starbucks, 7-Eleven, Wells Fargo, Bank of America. They see corporations.
Yeah, no, I've noticed that, and it's actually there was a quote that Lenin said, so I'm gonna just like contextualize it, and he basically was like, the leaders of the revolution are gonna come from the working class, not from the intelligentsia of the left, or like you're typically aware like leftist organizer. So and that proved so true, especially in my area. When this started, I was still afraid to go outside because of COVID, but I was doing communications for a protest where I was monitoring police frequencies and telling protest organizers what the cops were doing. And one of my friends was leading a whole group of people onto the highway, and they cut all traffic on Long Island on every major highway.
Yeah.
And this was a kid that I went to high school with, and I never would have imagined him doing that.
Yeah.
And it's just the natural leadership of the workers just pulling through.
Events change
So
people. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and it was just it was wonderful to see that there's hope. That gave me a lot of hope that there could be things going on. Like, I feel like worn out after doing this for so long, but then there's a whole new energized group of people that are ready to just step right in, and it's just like
Yeah.
it's rejuvenating almost. It's really nice to see.
Yeah, yeah, it is. And of course, the wonderful thing about time going on and people being born and people aging is that there is always new energy. And all it takes, I mean, it's, for people who were around Black Lives Matter in 2014, that seems very recent. But if you think about it, for so many of the people in the streets right now, in 2014, they were 12 years old. And so it's an ancient history for them, and they were too young to really participate back in 2014. you know.
There's actually there was another thing, another song you wrote. It was essentially expendable, and it kind of shows how the unskilled jobs suddenly became essential. How working these jobs made you more likely to be one of the 200,000 dead. How does it make you feel that non-essential Americans treat this as a day off? And considering that a lot of essentials are people of color, would you agree that saying Black Lives Matter is hypocritical if you're a non-essential holding that attitude?
No, because anybody with a brain can say Black Lives Matter because Black lives obviously matter. So it doesn't matter what you do for a living if you can see that humanity, all humans matter. Then therefore Black Lives Matter. So I mean and Black Lives Matter particularly in this society because black lives are on the bottom in the society in so many ways in the caste system that we have. So black lives must matter. If any lives are possibly to matter, then first black lives must matter. So that's just an intellectual exercise that anybody with a couple of brain cells to rub together can make. But what kind of situations people are in terms of work, has so much to do with their circumstances and what kinds of what their educational background, whether they have inherited wealth, whether they have parents to live with, whether they have whether there is a house that's being passed down in their family or not, whether they're renters or not. There's so many factors. Of course, race is such a huge factor because in so many cases you can look at somebody's zip code or look at their race to a huge extent and tell us is this person a homeowner or a renter, is this person somebody who's inherited wealth or not. I mean, it's not that there aren't any wealthy black people who've inherited wealth, but it's the overall trend, the overall tendencies is that this is a largely race-based phenomenon, which is not to discount the fact that most poverty in the United States is white, which is also a fact, and that shouldn't be overlooked. And it's also a fact that is pointed out most often by black people, much more often than by white people, and which is a credit to all the black activists who see that how important it is to point that out. But it's also not necessarily a credit to the white activists for ignoring this fact, because it is privileged white people who like to talk about white privilege the most, and it is definitely a fact that white privilege exists and that white people are privileged in so many ways relative to black people. But it is also an interesting fact that the white people that are mostly struggling to survive are so often being overlooked by the very privileged white people who are the ones talking mostly about white privilege. And I wish that white privilege were something that could be more in the discourse among the working class, where we can talk about how white privilege is used and has been used for the past several hundred years to divide the white working class from the black working class. And that's been the main use of white privilege. The idea that I'm better than you because I'm white, or that you're or that for a black person to feel that they are inferior to someone else because they're black. That is the essence of white privilege, and that's the essence of how dividing rule politics has worked all this time. And it's not. And the divide and rule politics are we don't fix that problem by ignoring it and pretending that it's and being reductionist about it and pretending that all white people are privileged because they're white. And I mean, the term privileged takes on different meanings for different people, and it's important that people understand what kind of privilege people are talking about, because the way people talk about it, it's like they don't often define the term when they're talking about it. And of course, if you're in academia, you know what the term is about, and we're talking about comparative privilege, we're talking about biases and perceptions, and we're talking about multi-generational wealth being more of a tendency and all this kind. But you can be sure that the person living in east of the 205 here in Portland, living in a trailer with a massive American flag outside of their apartment and their fancy pickup truck that they're paying 18% interest on the loan for. These people don't hear comparative when they hear the term privilege. They just hear a bunch of elite white college students telling them that there's something wrong with them for existing. Basically, this is how they interpret it, and that's how Trump gets his votes.
That's what I'm saying. I part of the reason why I think the liberals, well, I think a lot of the impoverished rural Americans are Trump supporters, is because they are, like you said, excluded, and a lot of the college students that are liberals will say, "Oh, they're Trump supporters, they're bad," or
They're
they're
deplorables.
not
They might
looking.
as well be quoting Hillary Clinton, calling them deplorables.
Might as well. And they don't understand that the root reason why they're Trump supporters is because they feel like they've been robbed of their guaranteed economic stability. Because, when you're growing up as a white American, it's like you kind of expect to be living in that middle class lifestyle, like that everything's going to be fine. I'm going to live in a house. And then if something goes wrong, it's like, I'll get through this. But there's not like that nuance there, and I feel like white rural Americans don't even get the same social services that you would get in urban America. So like even in upstate New York, like if you go to a city, you're more likely to, if you're like impoverished, you're more likely to be more left leaning because you're more exposed to other cultures and you have social services. You're more taken care of, not that much, but you're more taken care of. But in rural America, you're kind of on your own and you have like a lack of interaction with other people. So you're more inclined to go to the right wing route. And it's why I think a lot of, impoverished people in the city, in downstate, are socialists or democratic socialists, because they actually understand the severe economic, what's the word? The intensity of the economic warfare, because it's so expensive there and everyone's broke. So they don't feel like they're temporarily embarrassed millionaires. They feel like they're proletarians that are getting robbed. So I feel like just the location and the lack of resources or put into these areas and like their makeup is what's really determining the outcome here. And a lot of the liberals don't understand that at all, and even some leftists, admittedly.
I mean, you're talking about a whole lot of different tendencies, a whole lot of different sort of ways that things can sometimes go, and they're all too. I mean, they're all there's with all of them. There's massive exceptions to the rule, and also things change depending on the circumstances. So the kind of rural urban divide that people have long talked about from Marxist circles has a lot of relevance, and it also has a lot of there's a lot of aspects of it that are not necessarily as relevant, depending on, or there's reasons why they happen that don't necessarily fit with the old rationale. Like, for example, why is if it might be the case that that people might tend to be more left if they're in the middle of Portland, for example. It's and rather than being attracted to more fascist kinds of ways of thinking, is basically the city has already been cleansed of most of its poor population decades ago. So, and that's true of cities across the country. So when you look at what the tendencies in terms of population moving around is as the center of the town, and not all downtowns have been revitalized like urban renewal didn't necessarily hit St. Louis or Detroit really, but for so many cities that where the people with money were often leaving as recently as the 1980s, and then moving back to the centers of the cities became very popular in the 90s, and continued to be very popular until very recently. And so the centers of cities like Portland, San Francisco, Seattle, New York, Boston have gotten, and with the deregulation of rent control and other kinds of the housing market, basically they've gotten wealthier and whiter, um, and then the people who have been pushed out of the cities in massive numbers, they have gone to the exurbs, which you can call rural America, but I think we need to be very careful when we're talking about these kinds of terms, because when we're talking about these exurbs which have no services, as you say, they're often in unincorporated counties. There's barely any taxation. There's barely anything in the way of services. If fires come, if it's in the West, those are the towns that are going to be sacrificed. They're going to be the first to burn. If they're in the Alabama or Florida, they'll be the first to flood. uh, you know, and they are where people who can't afford to live in the cities move to, and they are disenfranchised people living in those places to such a huge extent, uh, and so they are naturally going to be a base for somebody like Trump. But I mean, they could also be a base for a left wing. Movement or political candidate or something like that, if there were somebody who were able to reach them and speak to them, who could afford the TV time and whatever, and get to them. It's also, as you say, with the sparser population, it's also huge challenges in communicating. But then another thing in the context of the U.S., that's important to remember is that when we're talking about electoral politics, the people that we elect have very little to do with any kind of a reflection of the politics of the actual people of the country. I mean, we have only two parties, so people don't have much of an option anyway to begin with. And then in many towns, the Democratic Party completely controls everything. So they're in one party cities, one party towns, and things keep on getting worse all the time, and it's always Democrats in power. And then in many states, it's always Republicans running the state. So it's not, we have two parties, but really that's even an exaggeration to say that we have a two-party system. And then you have a situation where the rural states, the states that are mainly rural and have very little population, have a ridiculously undue influence on national politics. So, I mean, there's no way Republicans would hardly ever be getting elected to national office if it weren't for the fact that Wyoming and South Dakota, North Dakota, and Delaware, they all get two senators each. So that's which is has nothing to do with the population nor the demographics of the country.
Exactly. Yeah. The system is outdated, and there's been a lot of talk about abolishing the Senate and just having a House of Representatives. Personally, I think it should be structured kind of like the Soviet Union, where we had the autonomous regions, and then they all had trade unions elect representatives to the National Congress. I think that's the best way to do it. It really puts workers' power into perspective. And, I think I'm also looking at the rural urban divide from a New York standpoint. and I'm kind of hyper personifying it to my experience, which I apologize for. I shouldn't be doing that, but it's it's a very delicate situation nationally, especially once you get into the interior of the country, with the rural
I
states.
think New York is a great example to work with, because in New York you have everything. You have billionaires, you have urban working class, you have loads of sort of tech workers and people in the sort of high end entertainment industry and all that, and then you also have you have town after town after town in upstate New York.
Aw, you have a
Hi.
visitor?
There's Koto, my daughter.
Hi. Aw, hi, Coco.
You got
That's so cute.
you got all these towns like Elmira and Corning and Troy and Albany and Buffalo and you just town after town. I mean, you drive through you drive from Albany to Buffalo, and every city in between Albany and Buffalo, as far as I can recall, without exception, except for the occasional college town. But basically, all the cities are post-industrial shells, with people living in destitution, with a massive suicide rate, with a massive meth addiction rate, with huge crime problems, with lots of people going to prison for all kinds of offenses. You have a society in a state of meltdown with no social services whatsoever. It's that's New York. That's New York State. It's all there within New York State.
I think I think the reason why a lot of rural Americans in New York, why a lot of rural New Yorkers don't like Cuomo, is because he diverts a lot of the state's money into cities instead of sharing it with rural Americans. Because some of these cities like Binghamton, Albany, Long Island as a whole region, New York City, as cities alone have enough funding to fund their own social services, or at least be able to take a little bit away and give it back to rural New York, because there's not enough money put in here. If you look at Deposit New York, there are more people in that cemetery than there are in that town, and
Yeah.
there's meth all over the place. It's not known for anything. They just defunded. They got rid of their police department. The state polices the whole town because they don't
They
have
don't
enough
have any
money for their
money,
own
yeah, or
police.
for a library. I mean, and Cuomo is just like all the Democratic governors. He can give a speech a little better than some of them, which is stunning. How many of them can't even give a decent speech? They represent millions of people, and they can't even give a decent speech. Like Governor of Oregon, for example. But Cuomo is just he's just a servant of the real estate speculators from all over the world. He is a stooge of the oligarchs from around the world. He's neck deep in dark money from the banking industry, from the offshore investments. The whole way that New York is set up is to facilitate the money of oligarchs from around the world to be invested in real estate in New York. New York is a mafia state, and that's true of. And I'm not saying that because he's Italian. I mean, it is a mafia state that happens to also be run by Italian Americans as well as other people. The mafia is not a Italian phenomenon in the United States. We're talking about the finance mafia, way bigger than any kind of Italian mafia could ever hope to be, and the global finance mafia. That's what runs New York City and New York State, and Cuomo and De Blasio are just I mean, they've both done a bit better job than many mayors and governors in the country in terms of providing some social services for people. But the social service, but then you got to ask yourself why and what are they for, and in whose interests are these social services, and who's paying for them, and where's the tax base that's coming to pay for the social services? When you look at it, it's so much. About making sure that cities are good for investment. Because you can't have you can't have a whole bunch of abandoned properties and crack houses and And the price of the cost of the price of the houses goes down. You have to have nice parks and big police forces to clear the tents out of them, or else the property values go down. So the investment is so much in the services is so much oriented at making sure that the cities are a good investment for the real estate investors. That's their constituency. So I mean, if you look at what's good for the real estate investors and their clientele, then you'll figure out most everything that either Cuomo or De Blasio does is basically in their service. And of course, they do a good job of trying to make it look like they care about other elements of society.
I mean, we see it in Long Island. I mean, like, I can't afford to live there anymore. He had a meeting. Cuomo had a meeting with some of the millionaires on the East End, and they basically smoothed over some of the COVID violations that occurred there. When the chain smokers played there, and they made some business deals. So Long Island kind of got off the hook for some COVID violations, and he got some financing money for his next election. So and that's really what Eastern Long Island is. I live next to a dump, and it is the highest point of elevation on Long Island. I was driving home one day, and there was smog fog, like just a thick layer of just garbage smog
From the dump.
from the dump, and there were 20 kids that got cancer at the local elementary school that's next to it
Wow.
in a predominantly black neighborhood,
Yep.
and teachers got it. It was a mess. So like Long Island is like the most segregated place in the United States, because if you, like, for example, in Bellport, right? It's where I went to school. There's Bellport Village, which is where the wealthy people live, and then there's North Bellport, which is where the working class people live. And it's divided by a railroad track. And basically, like, I think the unemployment rate, or the rate of poverty in North Bellport, I'm not even going to quote the number because I'm not even sure about it. All I know is that both of them are very high.
Yep.
And the police will stop you there. They will, my therapist was telling me that he was stopped and turned around because he's white going to North Bellport. And he said, "No, this neighborhood isn't for you."
Yeah.
That's what the cop said. And there's like there was another incident where the village didn't want responsibility for North Bellport back in the 70s, so they sold it to the town of Brookhaven to administer.
Right.
And we all know what that really meant.
Oh yeah, lots of history there in many different parts of the country. Those kinds of like states divesting them, or the cities divesting themselves of certain neighborhoods of their cities in order to basically not have to deal with school integration and not have to deal with funding schools in the section of town that's mainly black. It's just astonishing, so blatant. And this is all over the north too. This is not a southern phenomenon.
Oh, not at all. And, even in Long Island, like Robert Moses constructed all our roadways.
Right.
And he made a series of parkways. And on those parkways, there are bridges that are so low that buses and trucks cannot pass through. So what he did that on purpose, because at the time, and still today, people of color use public transit more than white people. And he didn't want people of color on his parkways so that they couldn't use his beaches and parks and live in his neighborhoods.
Wow, you know what? That's so amazing. And I never knew that, but it makes so much sense. I always wondered, what about all these parkways with the low bridges, and what is that? And how are people supposed to live in these neighborhoods? And yeah, that's okay. That's so
He did that in your city, too. He did that in your city. He designed stuff for Washington State. That's why you guys have really low parkways.
Oh, I see. I grew up in Connecticut, so I was always going to upstate New York for all kinds of different reasons. And I noticed, like in the parkways, like the Merritt Parkway that goes through southern Connecticut towards New York City, the Kisco in Mount Kisco, New York. There's a parkway. I used to have my cello. I took cello lessons as a kid, and my cello teacher was in Mount Kisco, so I would. Yeah, very familiar with those parkways and their low bridges. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the reason why. It's even in our infrastructure, there's racism.
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah. And of course, in where they put the highways, too, because it's in so many cases they just went right through the center of the black neighborhood in a given town.
Or you look at the reservoirs in upstate New York, and they're on the sites of former towns that were flooded and eminent domain.
Right.
You know, and that's why a lot of I was skateboarding one day in Oneonta a few years ago, and a resident came up to us, and he's like, "Just you wait. One day we're gonna take over those reservoirs and shut your water off."
Oh, interesting. Somebody who still resents whatever happened like 70 years before you were born, huh?
Oh yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah,
sure,
yeah.
sure. It's personal. Yeah,
It was it's still like a really big it's a really big
yeah,
contention to this day,
I bet.
even in our college town, like because we handled COVID terribly in Oneonta. I don't know if you've heard about how we've handled it, but we didn't mandate testing or quarantining. We had over 700 cases in 4 days, and the city, the people in the city were blaming students exclusively for this spread, even though
Yeah,
administration didn't test and encouraged parties, and the mayor was like he started cementing this anti-student rhetoric to
right.
where it was like we're jeopardizing the war on COVID's progress, we're aiding and abetting an enemy.
Without then, there needs to be a national response, and the idea of blaming individuals when there's no effective response is ridiculous. Even how are people supposed to quarantine when they live with families? I mean, when you look at, or in the case of so many people, when they live with multiple families, you look at how they quarantine people in China, and they got their own rooms for weeks on government expense. That's the kind of that's the kind of response you need. And there's no shortage of empty hotel rooms during this pandemic. It's not like it would be very difficult for the government to mount the kind of effective response that's needed. It's just that there's no political will for it.
And there's even homes. I mean, there's 18 million vacant homes and 500,000 homeless people. We could
Right.
solve two crises at once.
Easily. But then you end up but the problem is that it's not about housing the homeless, it's about how much money the real estate speculators can make on their investments, and that's what matters in terms of housing, in terms of this, as far as the system goes. So any kind of solutions to housing are always going to be band-aid solutions, like we'll put a little bit more of your tax money into paying more money to landlords and banks to buy more housing from them and to rent housing from them in order to house the people who are unable to afford housing because the market is so uh, high. It's just the circular logic that doesn't work because they're not addressing the problem, which is unregulated capitalism. I mean, if there is a room in a healthy society for some kind of a market or a free market or some element of capitalist institutions like that, I would say that maybe there's a lot of useful aspects to the idea of having things like money to symbolize, represent the value of things, and to have things like trade, and to have companies that make stuff that people want to buy. I mean, there's a lot of this kind of stuff that's potentially useful in society, and I'm not necessarily an advocate of throwing all the babies out with all the bathwater, but we can do so much better than this. And when the basic needs in life are open to being just tools for capitalists to make lots of money off of, when things like healthcare and housing are capitalist investments and they're not rights, human rights, then society has gone to hell. And then it's not a redeemable society.
Yeah, there's no going back to reforming this. You can't reform this. It's impossible.
I wouldn't think so.
I I agree with certain reforms, and to an extent you can reform certain things in certain institutions, but the whole thing, like, you can't.
I mean, with
It's
enough
just got to be
pressure from
changed.
below, I mean, this is how change happens, but it's not going to happen by, when you're talking about reform, it's not going to happen by electing Democrats because that's already been tried. It's not going to happen by, efforts to change the Democratic Party from within. Although if that works, it will be because of massive movements on the streets. But that's what drives real reform. I mean, when over 100 cities are on fire at the same time, no matter what they say about the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of rioting, as they call it, the fact is it is effective, and it does cause the powers that be to take notice. And other things are even more effective than rioting are things like rent strikes and general strikes, and which are also about property and and not destroying the property, but preventing the so-called owners of the property from profiting from it or having access to it, which is what strikes do. Whether you're talking about an industrial strike or a rent strike. So from the angle of the property owners, it's at least as violent as a arson. But whether or not it's perceived that way by the regular people. But in any case, these kinds of tactics that have a tremendous impact on the economy and on the ability of the rich to continue to exploit the rest of society and the environment and the working class, et cetera. Those are the kinds of tactics when you disable business as usual, when you shut down the cities, when nothing can happen in the cities because they are a constant battleground, like Portland, then you will have an impact, and they'll call you all kinds of names, but you'll have an impact that will lead to what we can call reform. But the reform is going to be driven by what's happening on the streets, and the reform will happen because the people carrying out the reform are going to be either talked into it, or they're going to, in one way or another, it's happening because of the pressures from the street. Which is not to say that Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez doesn't have really great intentions, and if it were up to her and Ilhan Omar to run the U.S. government, I think it would be a much better society if they could just suddenly be put into power. But it's people like them being able to drive the kinds of reforms that they want to put out there. Those kinds of reforms are not going to happen without massive pressure on the streets, because you can be sure that people like Schumer and Pelosi are never going to be giving in to any kind of pressure from the real reformers for the kinds of reforms that we need. But not if the pressure is only coming from a handful of people, authentic leftists who have been elected to Congress, which does exist, I would say. But it's just a handful, and but they do, I think, have the potential of changing the policies of the government, both parties, potentially, if there's enough pressure on the streets. Then anything can happen, because they ultimately they need to keep society governable, and that's why they keep on extending the eviction moratorium again and again. They're terrified. They are terrified, actually, and it's important. Everybody, I think, should understand that. And they're terrified, and the rich are terrified, and that can go in different directions. I mean, that terror can lead them in many different directions. It can lead them to make socialistic sorts of reforms, and it can lead them to put all their faith in an authoritarian leader if they feel like there is no hope for the kinds of reforms that are needed. Then they can go the other way. But generally, I'd say these things go in different ways. But of course, what they're trying to do, most of all, regardless of whether they go towards reform or towards fascism, is they're trying to avoid either of those eventualities through divide and conquer propaganda tactics, which might lead them into fascism anyway.
That's why I think settle for Joe is a really bad idea, because what's going to happen is that there's like 4 possibilities, and the first one being if Trump loses by a slight bit, he's going to contest the results, and then it's going to be bad. There could be his people will get in the street and try to fight for him to stay in power, and that could pressure the military to pick a side. The second result is that he wins and he purges the country. The third result is that he loses by a super majority. No one really votes for him, but his supporters and his radicals are still going to be there. So then they take up arms and try to fight back. Or, yeah, those are like the only options I could really see. I don't think it was 4 options. I thought there were 4 options, but I do that a lot. But those are the options that I see, and I don't think voting Joe Biden's really gonna get us
No, I mean,
anywhere.
if the past few months have taught us anything, it's that we can't predict the future. I mean, because things, so many different things can happen, and there's always so many different actors involved with this massive stage, on so many different sides of the equation, and so that tends to just change things in its innumerable possible ways. So I'd say there's always going to be more than four possible scenarios that could play out. But that certainly, when the people that are talking about, like, who playing out the possible scenarios and coming up with scenarios and how they might play out, it's certainly what they say a lot, is that if Biden doesn't win by a landslide, then the possibilities for Trump to find a way to usurp power, whether he's won or not, are myriad possibilities out there. But of course, what people do on the street is also going to have a tremendous potential impact, and and then, but then, what is unclear, I think, to me and to many people, is exactly how big is the authentic, what we could call the real left? How numerous are the people who see through the Biden, Biden's, capitalist, imperialist background, and who are really looking for a real alternative to these two corrupt parties? And then, on the other hand, how much real militant support does Trump and the far right have? And I don't think it's all entirely clear yet. But there's worrying signs that that the far right is, under Trump's leadership, is effectively managing to organize in fairly large numbers, and sometimes you see that indicated on the streets of Portland, and also I would say online. I mean, sometimes, like recently, I wrote a song about Michael Reynol, the anti-fascist who was killed in a hail of bullets by police going to the apartment he was staying at outside of Lacey, Washington, just opening fire. And this was the man who had, in self-defense, shot the Patriot Prayer member who was part of the Trump cruise that was attacking people in downtown Portland a few weekends ago, where 600 pickup trucks with American flags full of more than 1,000 far-right activists, many of them with loaded weapons, came to attack people in downtown Portland. But like, after I wrote the song about Michael Reynol, when you look at the comments on YouTube, it's fairly evenly divided between people that are wishing him to rest in peace, and people who are wishing my death. So it's there's a lot of far right people out there, both in the real world and on the internet.
It's terrifying, especially because this is like where they organize, is specifically on the internet. And I remember when memes were a thing, and it was about 2015 or 2016, I realized that they became politicized and used as weapons, and that was their first like recruitment tool, was to just use memes. And then what we thought was a joke ended up becoming real life, and now we have the terrorists walking around Kentucky and Louisville with loaded weapons, and then leftists getting threatened with their lives, or like people harassing you on the internet or in real life. It's terrifying. It's really, politics has become violent in the United States, and we are at a real tipping point.
I mean, there's
Oh,
always been violence, of course, but it's, yeah, I know what you mean. But what do you mean by the memes being a recent phenomenon? I mean, memes have existed forever, haven't they?
well, I mean, if you look at the academic form of meme, they've existed since the 70s, but I'm
Oh,
talking about like internet memes specifically. Like, they went from being cute little double text memes to having more subsistence and more absurdity. And what ended up happening was that in around 2015, 4chan, Reddit, and iFunny ended up becoming, having these little microcosms of alt right humorists and propagandists that made their own memes. Like, how leftists make our memes about like Jeff Bezos, for example, or Joe Biden. Well, they would do that to promote their own ideology, but they would do it with the specific intent of marketing it to the people instead of just, oh, this is funny, this is our own little niche humor. They made it so like the left can't meme. That was a big one back in the early days of this, and basically saying that the left is not humorous. They can't take a joke. They don't. They're gonna destroy our society. They're too uptight. So that's what the left can't meme represented, was
Mm.
that we're, a bunch of fuddy duddies, and we
Ah,
can't do
okay.
much. So it just got more intense. Like Richard Spencer wore a Pepe the Frog pin when he got punched in the face. The alt right took that meme and appropriated it, like they did the swastika, to suit their own agenda. So Pepe the Frog ended up becoming Pepe the Trump, or using those variations. So it seems silly to people not in the Generation Z, late stage millennial, but it's actually been so effective in promoting those ideologies to the younger kids and to the late stage millennials. It's actually quite frightening.
Hmm. Yeah, if
So
it works to convince people to believe this nonsense, but I think it's whether they have clever memes or not. I think the success of the alt right is largely has so much to do with the lack of ability of any kind of a good coherent left movement to put out their beliefs and ideas and strategies that don't involve reforming the Democratic Party, and do involve doing something useful. And I think that hasn't existed in a big way in this country for a long time. But also, of course, the right gets so much support, and the algorithms of social media platforms are absolutely serving the interests of the right and the corporations, and are just a terrible disabling factor for any kind of meaningful discourse or effective organizing to be able to take place. And it's a really that is scarier to me than anything any of the right wingers are saying, is the platforms they're saying on. They're saying these things on, and how these platforms amplify their voices through their algorithms, which have nothing to do with creating any kind of a sensible society, or providing people with any kind of content that's useful, or potentially educational or interesting. I mean, they are promoting effectively, they are constantly promoting misinformation through their algorithms, because they're promoting stuff that's popular, stuff that inspires emotional response, stuff that will keep you on the platforms longer to see more ads. It has nothing to do with what is good for humans in any way, and everything to do with what's profitable for Google, Facebook, and Apple and the others. So it's that is all. And what's even perhaps more alarming is the fact that most people still don't seem to understand what these algorithms are and what they're doing. And they still look at it as a debate. Especially people older than me, or maybe my age and older, don't seem to understand about these algorithms. And they think when somebody like Zuckerberg says we're going to be hiring 600 more people to monitor Facebook posts to make sure that we're not promoting far right content, or whatever nonsense he's saying, they don't seem to understand that the algorithms defeat all the best efforts of any of these people he's supposedly hiring to do this stuff. They need to change the algorithms, and then they're going to lose so much money. I mean, if they returned if the feed on Facebook were returned back to being a chronological feed of whatever your friends are posting, like it is generally to a large extent still on Twitter or Instagram. I mean, how that would, if YouTube and Facebook were like that, they become suddenly, I presume, a hell of a lot less popular, because that algorithm isn't an algorithm, and it didn't keep the people glued as much, and it didn't polarize the debate as much and sensationalize everything as much. But it's these corporations need to be nationalized and ended as entities, and turned into public utilities with strict rules of engagement that have nothing to do with algorithms.
It needs to be really controlled by us. It's actually terrifying that the kid that wanted to make a rating platform for the most attractive women ended up being the death knell to American democracy.
I
Um,
know.
it's this timeline is not real, and we could probably go on for hours about this, but we've been going on for close to an hour and a half now. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming on Backpacking America. And if you would like to say any last words, the floor is yours.
Well, I just love the idea of backpacking America, and I've had so much good times traveling around the U.S. before. We should talk about that sometime next time. But it's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Backpacking America. If you want more content and alerts as to when the next episode will come out, make sure to follow the Instagram at Backpacking America and the Twitter, BPA Podcasting. Keep it locked.